All right, everyone. This is Mr. E, the bearded music teacher, and I have another episode for you. It's been a while. I'm in the illustrious classroom here at my school, well, one of my schools that I teach at. And we're going to start by doing Unit 3 that I have in my series things. And now, again, these units are just arbitrary, really, when we think about it. This is a continuation from rock in the 1955, mid-1950s, all the way through to hopefully when we get to current day. I've been very busy, and so it's been really hard for me to get everything together. But before we jump into the content of Beatlemania, that's what this episode is about, Beatlemania. I want to make sure you guys are aware of something that I use a lot, and I'm not getting sponsored for this or anything. I use this like every day in my music classroom. And this also works for teachers as well. It is an application called Kami. Kami. Go to www.kamiapp.com. Again, that is kamiapp.com. And check it out. They are great with PDFs. It's a great tool for anything in the classroom. If you're a teacher, excellent. If you're a business owner, if you're listening to this and you own a business, it's a great PDF manipulation tool that you can buy. There's a paid version as well as a free version. So go ahead and check it out. Also, make sure you follow me on Twitter, which is MR_E_musicFCS. Again, that's at MR_E_musicFCS. And there I post things on like This Day in Rock and everything related to music as much as possible. So, again, this is an episode on Beatlemania, but let's provide a little bit of background, shall we? When we ended the first wave of rock, we have this hole, this vacuum, where we're looking for the new Elvis. And I'm reading, one of the books I'm reading is about Peter Grant. And Peter Grant is a British guy who had some run-ins with some of these guys that pop up during this time. So if you look at this time during the mid-1950s into 1960s, we're talking about the day the music died and after. Really, it's like a 3-4 year period before Beatles actually hit the main stage of things. And so they were looking for the new Elvis. At this point, Elvis had kind of he isn't dead at this point, okay? But he is kind of taking a step back. If I remember correctly, he's at this time enlisted in 1960, or at least he's out of the spotlight. And so we kind of are left in the music business and rock specifically going, okay, where is the next Elvis going to happen? Where is our next golden goose, if you will? And little did we know it was going to come from 4 guys from Liverpool, England. But we also have to look at the impact of British music on American pop and British music in its role with the audience of Britain, of Great Britain in the United Kingdom. So we have 4 major record labels in Britain, and that's EMI, Decca, Pi, and Philips, and only 2 radio stations, the BBC, which is British Broadcasting Centre, I believe. I could be wrong, so I'm sorry for any Brits out there or people who have have that knowledge. All I know is as the BBC. And then Radio Luxembourg. The BBC was the main one. That was the big thing. And beginning in 1958, the BBC had a 2-hour radio show hosted by Brian Matthews, if I remember correctly. And that became the weekly source of rock music information in Britain. And what happened was they really pulled the rock music from American pop. Rock music at that time, rhythm and blues and rock and pop music from America was the thing in not only Britain, but also across the continent in Europe. So when we talk about Beatles, we'll talk about how they went over to Germany and they were really told to play all the hits like Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, all the ones that are from the first wave of rock coming in and making their big thing. That's what they wanted. So Britain really embraced rock. And when we look at rock and heavy metal, because I am a huge fan of heavy metal, Britain is like the second stage for heavy metal and rock, even now, we have the American scene with rock, and even in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, we have American heavy metal and rock, and we have Britain's heavy metal and rock. And Britain is like the next thing. It's really good, and it's still really a good stage now, even bringing out a lot of popular heavy metal bands. So let's take a look at the Beatles before they were actually American pop artists, and this is going to be very very brief overview of the Beatles. There's classes specifically that last a semester, if not two, on just the Beatles, their songs, the analysis of their songs. It is super, super extensive. So this is very overall, just a very brief, broad thing. Now, they formed in Liverpool in 1957 as the Quarrymen. And at that point, it did not have the same lineup as we think of the Beatles today. A lot of you may know Pete Best and Stuart Sutcliffe. Those are the ones that were in the Beatles, if I'm not mistaken. So John Lennon was born in 1940. Paul McCartney was in 42. So they were 15 and 13, respectively, when the rock music broke out on both sides of the Atlantic. So they were really young teenagers at the time. And they were born in a very harsh environment post World War II. Not as harsh as the rest of of Europe, but I mean they still were born into a lot of bombed out buildings, a lot of very rugged things. And we get that a lot. You'll see that in other places as well. From this wave of rock with Beatlemania, the American response to Beatlemania, and even into like Black Sabbath and other things. Judas Priest also reflects on those kind of days leading forward. But what they did in 1958 as the Quarrymen, which included George Harrison on lead guitar, they did a recording, which was their first recording. If I remember right, it was That'll Be the Day, pretty sure, of Buddy Holly. And they actually won a talent show under the name Johnny and the Moondogs in 1960. And Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison auditioned for the manager Larry Parnes. So their first main thing was that skiffle type stuff. And Jimmy Page is another big fan of skiffle. We'll talk about him when we get to the Yardbirds. But anyway, so they were big into skiffle, big into the rock scene, specifically skiffle and what was called rockabilly, more Buddy Holly type stuff. They were really focused on. They loved that stuff. And so in the lineup that went into Hamburg, now it did kind of rotate a little bit, and we do have documents to say that there was other people involved, and we do have very documented things. There's lots of great books out there that highlight that. But the lineup with Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison were all playing guitar and singing. So they actually had 3 guitar players at the time. And they went into a 4-month stint in Hamburg, Germany. Now, there are other ones, like I said before. You have Stu Sutcliffe and Pete Best. They're also in there as well. But when we get into Hamburg, when they go to tour in Hamburg, they start to break down. The drummer leaves, and they pick up Ringo Starr. That's where they met Ringo Starr, who is Richard Starkey by name, by birth. And he comes in, he sits in on a couple gigs, and then he just decides to join. He was originally from the band called the Jets, and they were from London. And he played with, they played with the Jets. Sorry, I'm mistaken. They played with the Jets, but Ringo Starr came from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. I'm sorry, I'm doing this all off memory here. So I believe that's what it was. I could be wrong. So if somebody wants to get a hold of me on that one, that's fine. So let's fast forward to now in the classroom. What we do is we do a listening activity with That'll Be the Day, and we compare the Beatles. So if you're the video watching this on my YouTube channel, we actually do a listening thing where we compare and contrast. That'll be the day on the BBC recordings that they did that can be found on the anthology. I think it's on the BBC version of the Beatles. Their release. The BBC released a bunch of recordings after Beatlemania had hit, and those are fascinating recordings. They're a massive amount of recordings, and they're great. But we compare that to Buddy Holly, and we come across the fact that there is not a lot of differences. They try to emulate as much as they can the sounds, and this was very, very particular when they went over to Hamburg. Now, we will briefly cover Brian Epstein here. This is the last little slide that we're going to cover for this episode. But what we have to realize, when they went over to Hamburg, Germany, they specifically focused on the sound that was from the records. And this is where, like I said earlier, that the British pop music was all rock and American pop. They grew up listening to stuff. They covered this stuff. And when they went to Hamburg, they wanted to hear this stuff. So naturally, what you want to do is you want to play the stuff that the crowd wants to hear. This made them such a tight unit. And we see that in their music in their earlier days, how they just kind of gelled and worked. And it was absolutely amazing how they really worked, even up until the end of their careers as the Beatles, as one band unit. That worked really well. But in 1961, Brian Epstein discovers the Beatles. And this is how the story happens, is that the Beatles in Germany recorded a cover song with, oh boy, I can't remember the name of it right at the moment. It was My Bonnie, and it was done by Tony Sheridan. Tony Sheridan, and it was backed by the Beatles. At that time, they were called the Beat Boys, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, or the Beatles. They weren't the Beatles. They weren't the Beatles at the time. They were like the Blue Beat Boys or something. But anyways, so they did this recording with Tony Sheridan, and it got over to England, and specifically Brian Epstein. And Brian Epstein's family owned a furniture store, a department store. And in that certain store, there was a department known for records. There was just one record department there, and Brian oversaw everything. Brian was very meticulous with how he documented everything and made sure he had great business sense in that regard. But he started getting a request for this song called My Bonnie. And he goes, well, what is this? And he was searching all over England for it. And he couldn't find it. He's like, I can't find this. And people were requesting it like crazy. He's going, I don't know where this is, and what are we doing? So he finally discovered that it was released in Germany. And he grabbed it. He ordered way more copies than what people thought he should have. And people were like, you're crazy. This isn't going to sell. And as a matter of fact, it flew off the shelves. And so this rocked up version of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean was just an absolute thing that introduced him. And Brian Epstein was like, whoa, this is interesting. And so he went up to him on a performance in the Cavern Club and said, I want to manage you. So let's fast forward to Decca. So Decca actually rejected the Beatles as their actual Beatles name after being turned down by several labels. Epstein was introduced to George Martin later on, and what he did is he took the Decca tapes and let George Martin hear them. And now George Martin, there's some confusion. They said that George Martin was in the actual listening when they approached Decca and everything and Parlophone, when they went to go do the EMI audition with the tapes and the audition itself. And so they were like, and then Martin apparently was on vacation. He came back and he heard this. There's some cloudiness. There's different versions of the story. But anyways, long story short is that they end up getting signed to Parlophone, which is a small EMI label. And so he goes and does this in June of 1962, and the Love Me Do is recorded. That's where Ringo officially starts with the band, is the recording of Love Me Do, replacing Best as drums. But Martin was wary that Starr's assurance of playing at the audition and hired actually a session drummer to record the date. But then we later replace him, and he works out just fine. It's actually a great thing. And they officially signed by the end of 1962 what Liverpool band had never done. And that's gone to London, signed a record contract, and placed a single on the UK charts. This is something that was very unique, very different. And at that point, we start to see in the world, we go, oh, I think we may have something. So we'll stop right there. Remember to check me out on Twitter. It's at MR_E_music FCS. Make sure you check out more of my episodes and follow me on Twitter. It's great. And until next time, I will see you, I guess, on the flip side, maybe. Let's use that cliche today. Have a good one.